I'm the moderator of the panel. My name is Lorraine Gutierrez. I'm a faculty member here at the U of M in social work and psychology, and a faculty associate in Latino Studies. I was going down memory lane yesterday because I was also a doctoral student here in the late 80s when this program was being created. I was a doctoral student in social work and psychology, so not in the program, but I remember the excitement when Sylvia arrived as the first tenure track faculty member for the program, and it's been just growth and excitement since then. I'm just going to say something about my connection to the Latino Studies program. I actually created and continue to offer academic service learning courses that are cross-listed between Latino Studies and the Department of Psychology, which provides credit for undergraduate students to do work in Southwest Detroit and to get credit for it and to have an academic component, either community-based research, empowerment theory and practice, or more of a reflective kind of seminars. So a number of concentrators do move through these courses, and for some students it's their first Latino Studies course. So each speaker will have about 15 to 20 minutes to do their presentation, and then we'll have some time after that for more general commentary, discussion, question and answer. And I'm going to move the mic now to our first speaker, Esteban Rael Galvez. He has a PhD from the American Cultures Program from 2002, and he's currently the state historian and the director of the Office of the State Historian and State Records Center and Archives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, for the state of New Mexico. In his role, he serves as the leading advocate and authority of New Mexican history and serves as the director of the Office of State of the Historian. The mission of the museum is to foster and facilitate understanding and appreciation of New Mexico history and culture through education, research, preservation, and community outreach. And Dr. Rael Galvez has also received recognition for his work on Western and public history.
Thank you. Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Emma. Thank you for bringing us together and rounding us up every few minutes to share and reflect and think back, and it's wonderful. Ordinarily, I would feel a little out of, like a fish out of water, but I join Rosa here as perhaps the only two individuals who don't have necessarily a university affiliation. But I never have, because my mind is still there, and there's reciprocity that moves back and forth between the institutions that we're a part of, the communities that we're a part of, certainly. Not only because of I don't feel out of place, not only because of my insistence of keeping my mind there, my heart in some cases, but because colleagues like yourselves, all of you really, and your insistence of maintaining these bridges between the academy and the community. So I thank all of you, and you've heard reflections of that certainly in all of the panels in many ways. We care about where we come from, and those things matter. We care about the social justice movements that not only shaped us in the early foundations that we heard about early on in terms of this particular program, but everything that led to that moment and continues in this particular moment that we're living, this history, to shape us forward as well. For me, it's interesting sort of personal reflections coming back to Michigan. Although I defended, I guess, in 2002, I keep saying 2001, but then I was like, 2002, my God. I left here in 1997, and in a very difficult moment because I had just become a doctoral candidate. I was actually 2 days away from flying to Ecuador to participate in an Indigenous Studies conference where I was going to share my work there. I was still enrolled at the law school, something I never ended up finishing after a year and a half here. But sometimes, as my grandmother would have said, the mountain, when it calls you back, you need to come back. I thought I would be old and gray, though I'm getting there, before it drew me back. But it was 1997 when I received a call that my brother was in a car accident and had severed his spinal cord. And so I was drawn back to the village. I had been raised a farmer-rancher, herding sheep, moving waters, something I was always losing both of. But at that moment when I was called back, I didn't hesitate for a moment. Finding my way back to finishing my work was the most difficult part, of course. And eventually that's why it took me so long, to 2002. So I just needed to say that, because even when I came back and defended in 2002, I didn't know anyone anymore, almost. It felt different. And so the people that I left behind in 97, it was an interesting moment to have left. And there's almost a gap, even in this conference, between those foundational members and then sort of thinking of those of us who came in, that were here in the late 90s, early 2000s. Of those that were in between, I think Diane Ibarra, Nancy Mirabal, and all these people who were also formative. I loved what Natalia used to describe herself when she was here as intellectually voracious. That was me as well. I was also insistent on being an interdisciplinary scholar, which would come back and slap me when I became an official state historian. But I was insistent, wasn't I, George, that I was just an interdisciplinary scholar. It was not about the real work was not being done in the disciplines. And again, this would all come back as irony for me in finding a way to reflect about these things. But I was also not, I was mostly shaped here by my immersion in cultural anthropology. And is another subdiscipline that helped shape this program for many of us. But for me, it was not just Latino studies. I was really forged out of the fire and tensions and sometimes disagreements between Native American studies and Latino studies. I taught the Intro to Native American Studies, I think, 3 years in a row. Eventually, I taught the introduction to Latino studies, but my work professionally was always moving between those two, and it continues to be so, even in spite of the positions I've held. As I said, I eventually came back into working in the university, finished the dissertation, which is very important to me. I'll only briefly mention. I write about the silence of slavery in New Mexico is foundational in terms of who we are in the Southwest. It is a story, to borrow from Toni Morrison, which Cass also shaped me here as well. It's a story, at least there, that was never meant to be passed on. And for those of us malcriados, entremetidos, who talk about the things that we're not supposed to, I dug into those records because it was a personal story for me. The weaving that hangs right above my desk to this day was woven by a great-great-grandmother of mine, Nana Cela, who was a Navajo slave, whose weaving teaches me every day about her labor, and her genetic weaving. And so these things shape us and tell us a little bit more about who we are. And so even though I haven't finished, that hasn't culminated in a book, in spite of the encouragement, it'll get there when it gets there. And I promise that, because it's as think I've just expressed, not just a professional story, but it's something at the heart of who I am. And who many of us are, right, talking about those stories. I became, as I often joke, an accidental historian. That will be a chapter in a book, I'm sure, at some point that I'll write, because it was ironic, right, George? Don't you think? I remember when I was appointed to the position, and my friend who was trained here in history, Natalia, immediately called me and said, "So you're not a historian, huh?" So yes, I'm the state historian. But I spent 8 years. I'm no longer the state historian, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But I spent the 8 years rewriting that script, not just interrogating what I even did in my dissertation, the colonial archive. and interrogating the discipline of what it means to be a historian. But I really tried to get into taking it back into the streets, as this panel asks of us. I often drew from Eduardo Galeano, who writes, and I paraphrase, "I'm not a historian. I'm an educator who would like to contribute to the rescue of the kidnapped memory of my land and my people." And so it shaped by my vision for what the office of the state historian would be in so many ways, and creating those bridges. And largely, though that reference is a recovery project, it was more than recovery. It was about connection, about raising consciousness, which in a place like New Mexico can be a very difficult place. Like any place, I'm sure, pulling back those layers, as Larry shared with us earlier, can really be a painful part of what we do in our daily lives. Leaving that position, and I only left 3 months ago, was the most difficult decision I've made in a long time, because I loved what I was doing as a state historian. There was a great deal of power in some ways, but if used correctly, in a good way. And I was trying to always reshape those things. I was involved in so many different initiatives, and I can't even begin to talk about half of them that we helped create. A scholars program that I'm proud of. Now that I left, we had funded over 70 scholars doing art research in New Mexico in 3 different categories: people who were working towards their graduate degree, people that hold their graduate degree, and my favorite category of all, independent scholars, really community activists, tribal elders. So it was wonderful to have them come into any archive in New Mexico. And though I think that budget is being whittled away in spite of my effort to put the office on autopilot before I left, budgetary constraints on the state are even chipping away at something like that. I recreated the office in terms of the power of legislation, drawing up legislation. I drew legislators closer to me and whispered into their ear as an educator, not a lobbyist, and participated in everything from removing language that was still in our Constitution of the alien land laws, which, though no one was able to use it anymore, certainly, thank God. It remained as part of the rhetoric on the Constitution that was shaping us. I wanted no part of it. To participating in campaigns like Somos Primos, that I'm proud of, that creates a dialogue between Mexicanos and Nuevo Mexicanos, to talk about not only those differences, but how we're so related, and the artificial frameworks that divide us, and the mythologies. So things like that. But I want to talk also about sites. I was inspired by Professor Ramirez yesterday, who spoke about sites, sites, and sites. In many ways, that frames my own work in the past several years. Contest of stories, sovereignty of context. Where am I? Oh, 5 minutes. Oh my God. I'm not going to be able to show you everything, but see, I spent too much time talking about me. This is one of the babies that I leave behind, but I hope you go to it. I won't be able to show it to you, but the Office of the State Historian Digital History Project, that this year won the Best Public History Project in the nation, which I'm proud of. And last year went to the New York Public Library. This site was really about interrogating even the institutions that we're a part of, to recognize the fact that our patrimony continues to be a privileged commodity in our society. In museums, in archives, in libraries, even in university settings. In the books that we create, I wanted to shift this paradigm. It's not the answer to all of these things, but it's certainly part of where I started to go. We have digitized over 500,000 items that you can find on here, pairing them with interpretive essays. But even every part of this has been reshaped. The timeline is not linear. anyone who knows me knows that I'm not interested in linear timelines as they exclude indigenous people. And I won't get a chance to show you all this, but if you get a chance to go to it, it's something I'm proud of. In many ways showcases at least a portion of our Latino histories. I'm not a digital person either, and everyone would always comment, but like, wow, who knew that you would end up creating something like this because you love books so much. But the idea behind this is really about creating a meaningful interface with our past that is also about future looking. If we fail to recognize the importance of that, we lose whole generations of people interested in looking at issues that concern us. Anyway, so I'm going to pull myself away from this particular project. You can turn on the light. Thank you. To talk about my role in that particular role as a policymaker, at least influencing policy. I also served as a chairman of the Cultural Properties Review Commission in that role. The state historian serves at that level. And so it was heritage policy that we were reviewing, state and national register nominations. So I asked the harder questions in terms of what are we looking at? Places like Georgia O'Keeffe, or are we looking at language, acequia culture, the way in which the cultural landscape connects us in deeper ways? We started a civil rights landscaping committee to understand how civil rights had shaped New Mexico that had not been recognized in the historical markers. But three things really shaped my tenure in that role as a chairman of that commission, in terms of asking, did you engage in tribal consultation? This opened up huge issues as we were considering the Civic Center in downtown Santa Fe that loves to celebrate its past in a very particular mythologized way, or even the most recent case that we attended to, the Mount Taylor. My last meeting, conducted on the floor of the Hall of Legislature, had 1,300 participants. My first meeting was in a room half this size. We catalyzed how we were reviewing these type of applications and really forced these questions of what does it mean to own the past? Who defines these issues? I created two more roles, a community member on this commission and a tribal role on this commission. But we placed against the greatest of odds. People didn't think we would do it. Mount Taylor on the State Register of Cultural Properties, which is significant to at least 5 different tribes. I wish I had the time to talk about the significance of that in terms of what it meant to those tribes, including Acoma Pueblo, the Navajo Nation, and what that meant in terms of the uranium mines who had a great number of lobbyists. I can't tell you the political fire that we went through. It's ironic that because I took these stands and was adamant, in spite of the fact that I could be fired at any given moment, because of how my role was drafted up under the legislature and under the governor. And the politics that I was having to deal with, it's ironic that I would have been appointed recently to this particular national role as the executive director of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, which is a great privilege to serve in. But again, I keep being put in these positions where I'm I guess forcing myself to grapple with these issues that I talked about as a graduate student, these institutions like who knew I would be running a museum, to talk about a performing arts center that should be interrogating how we are representing Latino-ness. There's so many things to talk about, but the term Hispanic, to wrap my head around that now I'm heading an institution that has that. It's a great institution. I'm probably run out of time entirely, but But I want to talk about all these wonderful things, but more I'm taken by what Jeff Chang wrote in The Nation a few months ago in terms of the creativity stimulus and our role in terms of bringing both artists and activists to bear upon a new form of creativity that could have bearing upon the institutions that we are a part of, let alone run. I have so many plans for this institution. It's a 51-acre campus. There's nothing like it in the United States. There are certainly Latino museums. We just opened up the largest contemporary Cuban art museum to have hit U.S. soil since 1944 because of the number of artists participating. We have a performing arts center, an education department, an archive, a library. But I have plans to create a research center and a policy institute. So stay tuned. I am now, in the words of Jose Marti, dreaming with my eyes wide open with this institution, and I hope you'll all be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. That was fascinating and quite a story. Our next speaker is Rosa Rosales, the national president of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, which is the oldest and largest Hispanic civil rights organization in the U.S. She's also is the founder and director of the National Association of Public Employees, a San Antonio-based union, and prior to holding this position, was the office director of the SEIU from 1997 to 99. She was born in San Antonio, Texas, and earned her BA degree in liberal arts from the University of Michigan.
Well, first of all, I want to give many thanks for this invitation. I'm really honored to be here. Special thanks to the organizers, Mr. Mora, Maria Cortera, and Emma Amador. Muchísimas gracias. It's been great listening to all the presentations. I think everybody had such great presentations, such great information that I always say that I learn every day from other people. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a late bloomer. I did not start the University of Michigan until I was 30 years old. I had 3 kids, a 1-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 5-year-old when we came to the University of Michigan. Of course, I came following my husband, who was getting a PhD from a Ford Fellowship, and after the 1 year of the snow and the ice and the bad weather here, I decided to get into the University of Michigan, and from the assistance of my husband and many other candidates for PhD that were very much my mentors in telling me to get into school, which I did. Being here was a great experience to me. I've always said education is a liberating force, and believe me, I used to be very timid and shy, and when I started here at the University of Michigan, everything was turned around. I did a 90-degree turn. There was many things that were happening here that I became involved. As a matter of fact, the teaching assistants were out on strike for better pay. My husband being a teacher assistant, of course, we all went out with the picket signs. The custodians were out on strike for better pay, and so we all went out with our picket signs and we're picketing and being in the demonstrations there. I also remember that we formed several organizations to survive. There were not too many brown faces when I was here, and that was we got here in the summer of actually in 1973. And so at that time, very few brown faces, and I guess that's what took away my shyness. Whenever I saw a brown face, I would actually walk up to them and I said, hello, my name is Rosa Rosales, introduce yourself, like they say. So that's how I began to be much more out of my shyness. I remember we formed the Association for Critical Social Studies, which would actually meet with different Latinos in studying many issues that affected Latinos and other nations. We also, I'm very proud to say that we formed what you call a Third World Minority Woman Caucus. And the reason we formed it is we had and it's always good to, somebody had presented already, get your documentation, be prepared. And I remember there was, and I'm not going to mention the professor here that was very helpful to us, that actually came to us and told us that there was a lot of money in the women's department, but not a single penny was going to minority women. That professor gave us all the information that we needed, and we realized, that's when I realized that the importance of belonging to an organization and not go by yourself and present anything. Once we got the information, would you believe it, we called a meeting with and this was Latinas, Asians, Black women, of all races that we had together. We did this coalition, and we did call a meeting with the president. He did grant us the meeting, and lo and behold, I guess the documentation was so blatant of not giving a single penny to minority women that the doors were open, and there was money coming in for minority women to continue their education, especially the non-traditional women that were coming back. So I'm very happy that that in itself gave me a lot of courage to continue. Many of the things that we did, there's too many, but we also held an immigration conference here at the University of Michigan, and it was very successful in dealing at that time, can you believe, in the immigration issue. I do remember that it was all of this going to the University of Michigan. As a matter of fact, there were some migrant students coming in from the Valley that looked at me as the person, the older woman, I guess, to hold on and get advice, and not knowing that I was as much afraid as they were coming into school. But you know, I pretended to, and then my husband was always there as a resource, so we were able to survive. I don't know if you all know Iracema Garza, who happened to be in the Clinton administration. She headed the women's department. She's a graduated from here. Eventually also got a law degree. You know, Ken Salazar is also a graduate from here. So University of Michigan has many successful persons that have high-ranking officials right now in the administration and previous administrations, okay? I also would like to say, like, the topic here is taking it to the streets, closing the gap between the university and the community. I would like to say some of the things that I think that the university or the students or you know, people of interest can get involved. There's many issues right now that are very dear to me. One of them, of course, is health reform, that we're still not there. And we could get Congress, call you congressman, call you representative, get the community involved, have some public forums. Like this would have been a beautiful symposium where the community could have been invited, especially those parents that have students that might be interested in coming to the University of Michigan. Anyway, that's one of the things, that health reform is very much needed. When you have most, 79% of all health insurance are owned by two, and I'm not going to mention which ones, but two insurance companies own 79% of all the insurance. So there's no accountability here, and we need the public option. Somehow or other, we need the public option, because there's not going to be any accountability, any transparency if we have the same, you know, they tell you to go to state, but if the two companies own 79% of all insurance under different names also, there's not going to be no accountability. We do need the public option. We have right now 18,000 persons that die every year from 2001 that have died because they have no insurance. We have 25 million that are underinsured, and what is it, from 48 to 46 million that have no insurance here in the United States. That is not acceptable, and that's what we needed. If we don't get it, it's going to go the spiraling. In fact, even my husband has insurance with his university. He has to pay almost like 400 to 500 just to cover me. And that is ridiculous. Can you imagine a minimum wage worker working out there? There's no way they can have insurance. But that's very, very important. The other one, of course, that is very important also is comprehensive immigration reform. They say that if we don't pass the health reform, there'll be no comprehensive immigration reform. But let me tell you, that is the civil rights, human rights issue. When you have 12 million undocumented and probably more, in the shadows, being abused every day, when you're having them by busloads taken to detention centers that are shackled from your hands to your waist to your feet, that is not acceptable. To me, that's the black part of America that needs to stop. when you had children recently, as a few months ago in the Hoto prison, over 300 children from ages 2 to 15 that were in prison with their whole family just because they had no papers, or the allegation was that, because some American citizens sometimes end up in those detention centers. That is not acceptable. And the only reason that this is a community issue, and also for the university, is that they say, they hear from the conservative, racist people that do not want comprehensive immigration reform, but they don't hear from us. And I know that everyone here is for civil rights and human rights. And I know that everyone here is not for children being in prison. And the way they're treating them right now, they're not criminals, they're not convicted felons. It's a misdemeanor to be in this country without no papers right now. But that is something that all of us, Senator Reid once told me when we went to visit him, he says, why are you as Latinos not making more noise? They're kicking you and slapping you. This is a senator telling me, I want to hear from you guys. What are you all doing? So let me tell you that there's something that also that the community, as well as the administration and or the professors here, can get involved. We also have the housing crisis, that people are losing their homes. A big percentage are Latinos, that we need to get into having the housing reform, you know, and that is very much part of something that we can do. We also have the census. When you have a Congress of Visitors that is coming and trying to make an amendment to want to know your citizenship status, that is not acceptable. Your congressmen and your senators need to hear from us because changes that is totally unacceptable. It's never been done before to question your citizenship here in the U.S., and you know what that means. Some of these congressmen are doing it because they're in tight races that are coming up, and they want to ensure that they're anti-immigrant, anti-Latino, and that's why we need to get involved. We also have the child labor. I mean, I knew about it because I was with Hilda Solis, the Secretary of Labor, who showed us a film that it was appalling. I mean, we know it, but sometimes we need to see it in black and white. That's why it's so important, those films that some of the presenters did, that is so important. Films say a million words, you know, where they showed like 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and 6-year-olds working out in the fields, picking berries, picking cherries. Just last night I saw NBC say this. You know, this is the United States that goes and fights for civil rights and human rights all over the world. When they themselves here, the child labor laws are not. They need to have more teeth in there. There has to be a change. The secretary did say she's going to hire more inspectors, but right here in Michigan, I think Walmart just said that they were going to stop buying from that company that actually were showing little kids picking berries and picking cherries. And they had a 10-year-old who was saying that he knew the cherries were contaminated, and if he was to eat them, he could either die, you know, or get very sick because of the pesticides and everything else. That is happening right there today, as we speak. Those are something that to me are very important to what LULAC was founded about it 80 years ago. It was for a better quality of life. Of course, it started with Mexican Americans, but now it's for everybody. All Latinos, all races can come into LULAC. And I know LULAC has been known sometimes as a conservative organization, but it goes through its phrases. You know, it goes to conservative, to moderates, to progressives, to liberals. But it has been 80 years in existence, and I'm very proud to say that I'm the only second woman in 80 years. So LULAC has come a long ways. You know, in 80 years, I am the only second woman, and believe me, that's another story that I would tell you in running for president for there. But the issues are many. We also, the voter education, the community, we're talking about community. The university could have some forums on voter education, voter registration. You know that we as Latinos made a difference on those key states. And so we need to get more voter registration, voter education. The need that we as Latinos do make a difference in electing presidents and our representatives over there. So that's also very important. Let me see what else here. We do have, and I would ask you also to join me, the Jobs campaign. You know, for so many years, there They've allowed this man without any kind of documentation to present to you lie after lie after lie. Someone told me once that worked for the CIA. They told me that the CIA has a word of, if you say a lie constantly, over and over and over, the community begins to believe it. So this is why it's very important. I know LULAC passed a boycott CNN some time back, did us no good. We do know now that we're not trying to hit the advertisers, because when you hit them in the pocketbook, that is going to make a difference. But I strongly believe that we need to stand up and tell CNN, that the program they did to be, by the way, Latino America, whatever it was, needs a lot more. It was really on the negatives. They didn't put in the positives about Latinos in this nation. And in the end, since I don't have that much time, let me just say that I believe that this university can have much more public forums and inviting the community, especially their kids, to come and see what it's all about to be in a university setting. I commend you for this one, but I do believe that you all could do more as far as inviting the public, the community here, in closing that gap. I've always said that the power, once the university gets together, the students with the community, that's great power. That is tremendous power to organize. In the end, as an organizer, I would say organize, 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 communicate, communicate, communicate. It is so important. You could also have, like when I was here, I aligned myself with the Chicano law students. We used to go to the prisons in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and actually teach the Latino prisoners, women, their GEDs. We did Cinco de Mayo, the 16 de Septiembre, inside the prisons. I thought I was going to go show them how to make arroz con pollo, but they showed me how to make arroz con pollo in there. But it was a wonderful experience. Let me just say that coming here this 4 years, my only regret is I was going to go into a PhD program, and at that time I was getting tired of the cold, and the kids were growing up, and we did return back. So let me say it's been a beautiful experience at the University of Michigan. Took away my shyness, and I became an activist. I went home and I started organizing because I saw a brochure when I was here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where it says, "Come to San Antonio, one of the 4 unique cities in the U.S." And I opened it up, and one of the things was a pool of cheap labor. Guess who the pool of cheap labor were? The Mexicanos, the Latinos, the blacks, So, I mean, when I got back home, there were hotels and motels, Riverwalk, and everything more beautiful than ever. But something had not changed. San Antonio was cheap labor, and that was by the cheap labor was being done by the Mexicanos, los negros, and, so. That I conclude. Let me just say that anybody that wants to know more about LULAC, there is a webpage, www.lulac.org. That you can find more about LULAC. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for your story and the ideas, I think, for us of how we can make more of a difference in the world around us. Our next speaker is Catherine Benamu. She's an associate professor of film and media studies and Chicano Latino studies at University of California, Irvine, where she teaches Latin American Latino cinema and media. She's also a former professor here at the University of Michigan, where I had the pleasure of getting to know Catherine. She regularly writes on the subjects of Latin American cinema and television, U.S. Latino, Latina, and ethnic representation, film aesthetics, cultural politics, and is currently researching the complex relationship of Latino, Latina urban communities to transnational Spanish language media. Outside of academia, she's worked as a film curator and media producer.
And my presentation is really quite modest, of a scale that's quite modest compared to the last 2 presentations. And I'm kind of humbled and very honored to be here. And I want to thank profusely Anthony Mora and Professor Maria Cotera, as well as Emma Amador, for inviting me back here to Michigan. This is where my best friends are. There are more best friends that are not in the picture that are here. And this is kind of a moment. This is Angela Munoz. And my own little modest contribution to the history of Latino Studies building was that it could not have been done without a faculty-staff alliance. Angela was directed MESA, the Multi-Ethnic Student Affairs Office, after Donnie Maroney, who actually initiated the Latino graduation each year. I think it was in 2003 through AWAMI, the Office of Academic Multicultural Initiatives. And it was because of this alliance that we were able to have a seat at the table when they were considering who would be the next dean of Rackham Graduate School. And I just want to remind people of that fact, that we need to be aware that's the first front of activism, is to look outside of one's own rank and status and consider what the larger community is and you know, who are the stakeholders in Latino studies. And we were really blessed to have both Donnie and Angela, who are no longer here, with us, supporting our efforts and actually helping us recruit students for our classes. Enrollments went up during the period that they were actually here. So I wanted to express that kind of gratitude. People have been talking about learning Latino studies as graduate students here, what that meant, and at the kind of cutting edge of a new pan-Latino transnational perspective. But it also is very important for faculty like myself. I had been doing a few projects in New York that might have been considered under the purview of Latino studies, but I didn't recognize them as such because at the time that I was in graduate school, most institutions only had Latin American studies programs, and I kept trying to push the limits of what that meant to be able to do migration research in a previous life as someone aspiring to be a social scientist. So what I want to talk about today is where this engagement with Latino studies led for me as someone who believes in media empowerment and the possibilities of media empowerment and the importance of media empowerment. And I think Detroit and the Detroit metro area present a particular case. And when I first moved to Ann Arbor, within 1 year, Comcast, the local Comcast, tried to take Univision off the air. And its argument was, after all, based on the 1990 census, because this is before the, you know, record-breaking 2000 census, there are only 3% Latinos, and most of them are in migrant camps, you know, up north. And so why do you want something in southeastern Michigan? Who's going to watch this television? And a number of us, including Francis Aparicio, and a number of other people, we got a petition together and actually contacted the community representative for Comcast. And lo and behold, they put Univision back on the air. But the full implications of what transnational media, and we've heard critiques of Univision, mean change when you start thinking about media broadcasts on the ground. And so one of the projects that I've been involved in, it's a multi-method, multi-site project, is considering local agency within large commercial broadcast organizations and what those local news agencies can do for a community like Southwest Detroit. And you'll see what I mean because I'm going to show a clip that illustrates this point. Okay, so Detroit, why is it important for Latino studies? Well, because it's got such a history, and I'm sure others, such as Lorraine Gutierrez and many others here, can speak about this. Jesse Hoffman-Garskoff has actually been working with students on creating, through oral histories and local archival searches, a more comprehensive history of Latinos in Michigan. And I love this T-shirt. You know, established 1914, Detroit. There you go. It's a corazon in the corazon. This is where Southwest is. For those of you who have not been to Detroit, up in this part of Detroit, you see Windsor, Canada, right here. This is not as nice as Georgia's map because it's all kind of dense and illegible, but nonetheless. And my point of the corazon is to demonstrate that it goes way beyond Mexican Town. It is now going up, you know, well past Michigan Avenue into the Arab American community. And there's also new communities forming in Puma 0387, according to the Southeastern Council of Governments, and moving even out of planning cluster number 5 into new areas. So there's some similar patterns to other large recognized Latino metropolises, even though Detroit is not recognized officially as a Latino metropolis. It has very important annual celebrations, including Cinco de Mayo. I highly recommend Cinco de Mayo in Detroit because it's a true manifestation of the pan-Latino character of Latino Detroit, with very, very serious low-riding activity. And these, I mean, it is an automotive. It's the Motor City. You celebrate Cinco de Mayo by cruising, not up and down Woodward, but up and down Vernon from, Patton Park to Clark Park. And everybody has their vehicle, regardless of who you are. Strong sense of regional Mexican culture from all over Mexico. Boricuas. And I just want to say that because this is a border city, and I'm going to get to La Migra soon, there are many also performative Puerto Ricans and Mexicans who in fact are Central American and Dominican. So you see a lot of very big Boricua flags, and they're not necessarily being held by people from the island or from the mainland. And their Brazilian culture is part of the Cinco de Mayo celebration. This is the Bagley Housing Gallery, which had this exhibit in 2007. Now closed. We're getting into that too. Not a happy story right now. There are a lot of community organizations. The public libraries in Southwest Detroit do an immense service to the community. They have fully bilingual selections, and they have a Latino Studies section right there in a very visible place, and they have all of the Spanish language newspapers, and they actually helped me with my project. They allowed me to recruit and even interview people inside the library. And of course, like other well-known, better-known Latino cities, it is a border town. And this community has been very, very instrumental in articulating relations across the border. For years, there have been some Catholic associations between St. Anne's Church and Assumption Church, I think in Windsor, where they celebrate each other's holidays and they cross the border. Artists cross the border. Mexican Town achieved its fame as a touristic location, largely because of Canadians, who were going across the border. But there's a kind of exceptional status of Detroit. And that is what I wanted to explore, which is that while everyone is talking about, Latinos being consumed and commodified through the media, it is one of the most unmediated places in the US, proportionate to the population. And it is also absolutely the most underrepresented Latino community in the US in terms of local political representation. So part of my study to look at the mediascape was to look at the billboards. This is once every few months or once a year, you see a billboard that has anything in Spanish or any reference at all to Latinidad. 90% and often 100% of the billboards are about casinos, country music stations, okay? But when they want to market targeted, like the Juanes concert, then they'll have a beer. So it's about alcohol consumption. And this is typical, as everyone knows, right, of inner city, so-called inner city neighborhoods. This is the ward map for Southwest Detroit. I don't think I need to say a lot about it.
That'll do it, right?
Yeah, that'll do it. Fortunately, it does not have any Latino representatives in the state, but it does have someone, Steve Tabachman, who's been very proactive and receptive to community concerns. This is my project. This is how I advertised it. It had 4 dimensions. And this is being done comparatively, again, to echo Stephanie Alvarez's concern with place-based research. I'm really trying to look at transnational media and issues of enfranchisement and recognition on the ground. So the first project looked at the flow, the areas of coverage for this media, which are quite weak compared to other metropolitan areas, certainly Los Angeles and Miami, there's no comparison. Then to look at viewing preferences and practices out of respeto to people. I did not interview them in their homes. I went to public locations, and that way I could see where media fit into the local public sphere of the neighborhoods. I've done a media industry survey to which I've had only 2 responses at all. To look at, one was by somebody who worked for Fox News, who now has left for Chicago. That's the usual trend. Who is Latina. And the other was from NPR, which was interested in what I had my findings, but really didn't have much to say about what any coverage that they had directed at the Latino community. And finally, I've been starting focus groups. This group that I've been organized in Detroit and in Ipsy, Ann Arbor, has to do with women at risk for domestic violence and telenovela portrayals of violence, which I can talk about later. Okay, so the mediascape actually reconfigures people's relationships to the local geography. Okay, it inserts them into both diasporic flows of culture, orients them to the region and to the local urban and neighborhood events. So I looked for points of access to this. Many people I interviewed actually did not have television sets, or they didn't have cable. They would go either to the laundromat or they would go to neighbors to watch. And so it's a kind of collective viewing experience. I'm really going through this rapidly. I just want to show you that the print media are still very important, which is actually that's the first stage, right, of media representation that has been for 2 centuries now, a very important staple mode of communication and coverage. There were 2 Spanish language radio stations. Right now I can only pick up one, which is La Explosiva at 1480 AM. A little bit more about them later. There was local Univision coverage that has stopped. Lourdes Duarte was on the Fox News. She went to Chicago. Fox Sports Network, Adrian Burgos, Michigan's own Adrian Burgos, actually did the first Spanish language broadcast from Tiger Stadium, during a game. But it was a regional closed circuit kind of coverage that reached as far as Wisconsin. Then there are those reporters of color who have been very, very key. And if you look, all of the coverage of the immigration reform marches were done by reporters of color in the Detroit Free Press. But where is the public media? Where is WDTE, right? Where is public television? Where is public radio? Nada. Okay, points of access. I looked at the agency also of local entrepreneurs to make certain kinds of media available to the people who live in Detroit. Surround Sound was a hip-hop reggaeton shop owned by an Arab American, where a lot of these kids would hang out, and probably some of whom ended up forming their own bands or would perform in public. La Rancherita, of course, Mexican regional music, the owners from Nuevo León, and supermarkets and flea markets. Okay, so immigration reform. There were demonstrations in Detroit, very unmediated in the national news, but thanks to the local WDT, one report did make it to the national airwaves through Univision. And through their report, one company that had fired 11 workers for not going to work that day actually rehired them out of the pressure of the national news broadcast. La Explosiva became much larger in its coverage. And through this event, it was important to see the interethnic alliances that were formed in the community, because many of the business owners in Southwest happened to be Arab American or Chaldean. And I'd like to show you a little bit of Jorge's work.
Organizadores de dicha actividad siguen solicitando el apoyo de organizaciones locales del área metropolitana. Esto para darle más fuerza a un boicot cuyo objetivo será demostrarle al gobierno estadounidense El impacto positivo que los latinos tienen en la economía del país. Ignacio Meneses es uno de los organizadores del boicot que se llevará a cabo en el área metropolitana.
Queremos el 1 de mayo demostrar y hacer valer nuestro trabajo, no trabajando para que sea una llamada al Congreso y al gobierno de Estados Unidos a que hagan una reforma amplia que de veras se respeten tanto los derechos humanos, civiles y laborales del trabajador inmigrante.
David So, presidente del Sindicato de Empleados UAW número 2234, que representa a trabajadores de la industria automotriz, es uno de los activistas cuya organización apoyará el boicot.
As trade unionists,
Todos los que forman parte de un sindicato de empleados saben que si un trabajador es afectado, es como que si todos estuviéramos siendo afectados a la vez, porque pertenecemos a un equipo. No importa si los trabajadores son indocumentados o no, vamos a apoyar la causa. Meneses comentó que la participación de organizaciones que no son latinas demuestra la importancia de la labor de los trabajadores hispanos en este país.
Esto muestra que es como debería de ser, que todo trabajador, todo ser humano, todo miembro de esta sociedad debe de salir en defensa de los derechos humanos, civiles y trabajadores de cualquier persona, sea inmigrante o no sea inmigrante.
Los organizadores del boicot esperan que más de 400 organizaciones locales los apoyen el 1 de mayo. Jorge Avellá, Noticias, Univision Detroit.
Jorge was laid off in June 2008 because the economic base for this operation, there was a recognition there was a public, there's about 250,000 Latinos who were able to tune in to this newscast every night, but they could not get advertisers because, again, there's a blind spot because of the donut binary racial construction of Detroit, which I can get into later, and which actually Sylvia Pedraza has been very instrumental in trying to get us to think beyond. And because of raids, and it's important to know that it's not just the housing crisis affected people who lived in Southwest disproportionately, but the raids, this is on the border, okay? And Detroit has an ordinance prohibiting interrogation of people, for any immigration related. But in fact, the sheriffs of Wayne County started assisting ICE in going into people's homes and so on, not just stopping people on the street. And business people, mostly either Arab American or Hispanic, suffered as a result. And that's where my other project came in, that I went to these local organizations that were reporting increasing incidences of domestic violence, and I was also seeing it on television, and I was thinking about the disconnect between representations and possible audience responses. And so I've been showing clips, I have samples in case anyone would see them, to women, and getting them to talk through in the third person, these issues. And I have, through this process, been able, some people have come to the screenings and then joined the discussion groups. So I can talk a little bit more about that later. Eso es todo. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Another intriguing project on how we can connect more to our local community here in Southeast Michigan. Our final speaker on this panel is Sylvia Pedraza. You've been introduced to her in previous panels. She is a professor of sociology and Latino studies here at the University of Michigan. Her scholarship is on the sociology of immigration, race, and ethnicity in America, immigrants and refugees as social types, comparative studies of immigrants and ethnics in America, historical and contemporary comparative studies of race relations, Latin American studies, Latinos in the U.S., and the Cuban Revolution and Exodus.
Thank you. I came with the idea that I was going to talk to you about taking it to the streets I wanted to point out that those of us who are recent immigrants, myself from Cuba, others of you from Puerto Rico, today we heard a very nice paper from one of the students on Zacatecas, that we have more than one set of streets, that there are the streets, of course, in this country, but there's also the streets back in Cuba, the streets back in Puerto Rico, the streets in Zacatecas, and that we want to have an influence of some sort in both of those places and to take our work in some way to both of those places. In the Cuban community, because it has always been so oriented to Cuba, to the past, this is often told as a joke in that, Cuba used to have 6 provinces, and then they say that, well, that Florida is the 7th province, of Cuba. And it's true, and at the same time, it also is a bit of a problem of what happens in the Cuban community, which is that because its experience has been so different than that of other places, because it involved communism, because it has been so isolating, that they also are so turned towards the island of Cuba and not often turned enough towards other Latinos in this country, in order to be able to make alliances and so on, that I see that as a problem. And yet I recognize that, for example, from my very own generation, my political generation, so to speak, the people who were roughly of my age or a bit older, a bit younger when we first came from Cuba, if I look at the institutions that we created as academics, and the first one was the Institute of Cuban Studies, another one, I guess earlier than that, was called Joven Cuba, then more recently there's the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy and so on, that again, they're all turned towards studying what we can do about Cuba, the possibilities of a democratic transition, the ways in which one can contribute to a democratic transition there, and there's not enough attention paid to issues of poverty in the community in Miami, to issues of the old age when old Cubans are all over the place, not only in Miami but also in Cuba on the streets. So that there is the peculiarities of that history has made some issues very important to us, and others I think that we have like a blind spot to. I don't know that that's equally true in all of the communities that we represent here today. I think that the Mexican-American community in particular, I think because it's so much older, and by the way, though, even though it's so much older and it's so much more American, places like LA, Texas, and so on, as I listen to you guys, New Mexico, have histories that are so old that they're like countries, there are many countries, many times the size of the country that I was born in. And then you have all these issues of historical representation and so on, which you so interestingly explain. But nonetheless, it seems to me that because the Mexican community has had a different history, a history that came out of race relations, a history that came out of discrimination, out of poverty in this country, labor migrants and so on, that it is much more attuned to those sorts of issues of inequality within the community. And carries them better. Okay, so I think that perhaps one of the things that we need to think about in taking issues to the streets is where are the streets that we're taking these issues to, I think that that's something that is important. Rosa, I think, did a very nice job of raising a lot of the issues that I think that Latinos in this country can and want to contribute to. I think that as I listened to all of us for the last couple of days, I think that part of what I have become impressed by is that, usually when people talk about Latino studies, I used to write these copy things about the Latino studies program, and that, there are people that are bound together by a commonality of culture and tradition and religion and language and so on and so forth. But really, you think about those of us who have been here for a couple of days now, I think that we're also bound by a certain wish to be public intellectuals, to have our work make a difference in the lives of other people, directly and indirectly. Okay. Now, directly, many of us, those of us who teach in particular, directly means, of course, through the impact that you make on your students, through the creation of certain programs, through our very own process of incorporation into the American Academy and so on, which is never an easy one. That those are ways in which we contribute directly, but I think that we also want to contribute indirectly as public intellectuals. I think that, for example, that we should, that is part of the expertise that we can have. particularly as the Latino community in this country becomes less and less invisible, or maybe more and more visible is the way to say it, that I think that we are indeed people that, as Rosa pointed out, that have things that we can say that are of value with respect to health reform, with respect to the census, to immigration reform, housing, media representations of the past and the present, that we want to contribute to all of those things, And I think I take pride in having and knowing that as a community that we want to reach out and we want to make a difference in all of those ways. And I think that it's important that in order to do so that we also be supportive of one another, that we try not to sabotage each other, but on the contrary to help each other whenever we can, that we have to build bridges among ourselves and not let some of the very competitive environments in which we work, also drive wedges between us, because I think that what holds us together is actually very important, and they're not just issues of commonality of culture, but issues in which we have a sense that we want to make a contribution to bettering the lives of Latinos in this country and also the lives of Americans in this country, that we are also Americans and that we want to contribute in that way. So as I think about where our streets lie, they lie in many places, and I think that, as I was saying, I take pride in the fact that we're all people that want to make a difference. Amen. Thank you.
So we have about 15 minutes for comments and discussion.
Hi. For the record, what a great panel. Thank you very much. And my question is for Catherine, because for the 7 years I was in Ann Arbor, it was very obvious to me that Latinos were not only invisible in Ann Arbor, but they were invisible in Detroit. People rarely thought about Detroit as a city that had a fairly significant population, primarily of Mexicans who came here back in the 1920s, right? In fact, one of the University of Michigan PhD students from the program in American Culture, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, Zaragoza Vargas, wrote a book about it, right? A very important book about Mexicans in the Motor City, which was the title of his dissertation, which you can find in the American Culture Office, right? I think it goes by a different title now. But you made the comment that the media basically ignores the Latino community in Detroit because it operates as by the black-white binary. And I think that's true. But I think if you think of a city like Houston, where the media pays a lot of attention to the community there, but it's split more or less African American, Latino, and white. It used to be almost one-third, but now it's 40% Latino and maybe 25% black, and the rest are white. What if all the black folks in Detroit turned white overnight? Same class position. You see what I'm saying here? Is that the media, the problem they have with Detroit, I think, is not that it's a black-white binary, but that it's a black city. And if the Latinos lived in a predominantly white city, even if they were only, as I think they are, about 6% of Detroit now, there would be a lot more media attention to them.
Actually, if I were to unpack that statement, I would probably end up in the same place, which is why I use the donut as the as the figure. But what's happening is that in the so-called public and progressive media, there's an affirmation, right, of Detroit as Motown, Detroit as having Afro-diasporic connections, which I very much support, and I think even many people in the Latino community also support. But the problem is that then in the kind of bias against Black Detroit on the WDIV News and Channel 4 News, for example, you have representations of African Americans, of human figures in the frame. When they get to Southwest, there's no one there. They literally can't put them in the frame. And so Jorge's work was so important Because first of all, he's Nicaragüense, and JD will be happy to know that his accent is not, he doesn't even try to feign this neutral Mexican accent. And he speaks to the Central American community there, but he was constantly trying to put people in the frame, business owners, people from all walks of life, to show Southwest in a very different way. And so I think part of it is this some of the social scientific discourse, with all due respect. Reynolds Farley talks about polarized Detroit, black-white Detroit, looking at inequalities, and inequality means black and white, right? And so then the liberal media or the public media see things that way. There's also the suburban sector, which I think you're kind of referring to, the kind of suburban consciousness and apprehensions about the inner city. So yes, I do agree with you. I guess I was not really clear about the layers involved.
One of the most difficult questions, or the most important questions that I get from undergraduates that are considering PhD work is, I like school, I like my research, I like my study, but I worry that if I was to get a PhD, somehow I'm going to be detached from my community. I'm going to be in an ivory tower. I'm going to be separate. How do you answer that question? And how do you answer it in relation to the University of Michigan?
I had no idea that I was going to work outside of the field of the academy, precisely in the two positions that I held and now hold. But as we were talking to someone, George and I, a while ago, about really making sure that you create options for yourselves and for your students, I'm glad that I have that badge. I probably wouldn't have risen, I certainly wouldn't have, to those two positions. But it also gives you a sense of authority. Even in those positions that I held. I mean, I look really young. I'm starting to change, but I people are always surprised, and they were when I came out. They expected to see the image of the old historian, I think, when I walked out of my office, and certainly in this. So people are always really surprised by that. There's a reason why I dress the way I do, because they're both racialized and youth issues that are working against me, and I'm sorry to bring that up, but it's there. We have to create those badges and the options to get those badges for people who are considering those options, and so you can do whatever you want to do. Just earn those badges, right? And because once you earn those badges, whether it's a JD, a PhD, or whatever, then if you want to go back into the community, you can do it from working within the university. Certainly, we have many examples of that happening at this conference. Or you can choose to do other things. Certainly policy work. Those of you who are interested in really setting the agenda, defining the agenda, are part of what those options create for you. And so I had no idea that I would go into these particular fields, and it really pushes me also. Yes, I ran a museum, ran an archive, but at the same time, if I would not be engaged and connected to the academic discourse of the university and people who are also setting these agendas and helping us think harder, I wouldn't push my own staff to think about how we become participants in those same sort of issues, right? And so I'm always when I created the Digital History Project, I was thinking how I have to push myself to think about issues of representation, what images we choose to put up, and same sort of issues.
I'm just thinking about, for instance, students pursuing small-scale projects. One of the things that I think that I've done, and the reason why I'm sitting at the table here as a first-year doctoral student, is my interest in pursuing work. I think urgent work, but more on a small scale, right? And students could, for instance, for a class, be tackling a paper and are interested in doing small scale projects. So I think that as an alternative, how is that feasible? How are small scale projects feasible? I could, for instance, in my own experience working with gay Brazilians in Newark, we started to explore in a circle of gay immigrants doing a homeland activism project. Where they actually participated in like this, and we queered this transnational network, if you will. But in the end, what I think I realized was, well, is this a small-scale project or is this a long-term project?
I want to answer George's question about what you can do at the University of Michigan. And I want to plug, we just got funded for this project that was initiated by the community. Some of those community and public historians who are people who are not PhDs, who are actually on-the-ground people who are documenting their own histories by doing oral histories, by looking in the archive. Elena Herrada is a community activist in Southwest Detroit. She's actually running to be on the charter commission to change the charter of Detroit, because in Detroit, they do not elect council members by district. This is why there's no Latino representation on the council. And she wants to get on the charter to help rewrite the charter to make that change, right? But Elena approached us in the Latino Studies program to bring together a group of faculty, researchers, and community historians to talk about the history of Detroit and to think through what it would take to create a museum and cultural center in Southwest Detroit documenting the history of Latinos in Michigan and the Midwest, the regional sort of history museum. And so it's a small-scale project, it's a, $15,000 it's a year long, but we see this as a vital community partnership, and we also see it as a place for graduate students and undergraduates to come in and do their particular research projects related to this, to build the knowledge pool and to start working with the community to really sort of make a kind of bricks and mortar thing happen, right? But that can't happen unless and until we, learn more about our histories and we learn more about the way the community functions in Southwest Detroit. University of Michigan, apart from a few of the things that Lorraine and Catherine have been doing, really hasn't been engaged in Southwest Detroit. And so I think that we, are right on the cusp of a moment of engagement, and I'm very excited about that. So that's what we're doing here.
I'm interested in researching the common thread between Native American communities and the Chicano-Mexicano community, which I think has been largely neglected in academia. What advice do you have for a student like myself in pursuing what direction should I take, and also how hard was it for you to navigate between the two programs?
You know what? There are certainly going to be theories there's going to be classes, there are going to be theories, and there are going to be professors, there's going to be support networks that can be part of that. But ultimately, go back to the core stories or core values and start pulling those layers back. All I needed to do is, I'm interested in the issue of slavery, or I'm interested in my grandmother who happened to have left the village, her own Pueblo village, is the one that raised me. She was raising me in the context of a Hispano village. And I just had to understand what that meant for her, that loss, that detachment from her own indigenous village, and get back to those core stories. I mean, I don't know. I don't have any specific advice for you, but I just knew that here, one of the things that I had to do was gather a community around me to try and understand what I was interested in back home. That meant for me really understanding the indigenous community here as well as the Latino community. And there, I think there were times when I was sometimes feeling divided, but when I came back to the center of who I was and what those communities were, how they define themselves, being at the powwow, participating in the powwow on an annual basis, and not letting other people's agendas really define it for you, because people will have those other agendas. In one way, yes, it's true, it was easy when you had a supportive environment. For me, that supportive environment happened with some core faculty members here, but it mostly happened with community members who knew who they were, even if they were a number of different identities, right? And so just come back to the center. I mean, that sounds trite or whatever, but if you know those histories, study them, pull those layers back, and then you'll find what you're most interested in.
Latino Studies really was always involved with the community. I mean, Lorraine did that, and it was things that came out of our students, not from us. I mean, for instance, when one taught the introduction to Latino Studies, there would be a number of students that want to do community projects, and they would get support. In it, they would collect oral histories, they would do research in their own communities, they would go to Southwest Detroit and find out why and when, or to other cities in Michigan, like Flint, like Lansing. I myself was learning a lot from my students since I came from a different Latino perspective, being Colombian and having migrated. So you do, I mean, that was always, and that's what I loved about Michigan. And when I went to other institutions that maybe had a reputation, they were like set paths to have your community activity. While here, there was just the field and the support, and what Esteban is saying, each one would find their own way and would find enough. Residential College had a number of projects. I mean, they were throughout, and we used the resources from Multicultural Services, which I don't know if it still exists, and used those as well. So, and brought in African, American, and Latino relations about race, about status in the student community. So those are things that you all can do wherever you are and throughout your life.
Hello, my name is Luz Jimenez. I am a senior at Loyola Marymount University. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. And first of all, I wanted to thank everybody who was responsible for getting myself and the rest of my peers here. I think that I speak for everybody when I say that we very much appreciate it. And moving on to my question, speaking for myself at this point, graduate school is still kind of a vague idea. It's something that I would very much love to pursue. But and being here has made it more accessible. It's more feasible to imagine myself at a place like the University of Michigan. However, I would like to hear a little bit more about your experiences. What had you decide to come to a place like this? How difficult was it? Maybe share a story if you feel inclined to do so. Something that'll make it even more accessible to us, because you all say that you're trying to connect, your studies to the streets. Well, we're like on the intellectual streets. Get us into the building, So like, so how do we go about doing that, So thank you.
I'm currently the director of a doctoral program in social work and social science, as well as the other things I talked about. And I talked to a lot of sort of people in your situation who are thinking about graduate school and maybe aren't sure if that's what they want to do, why they might want to do it. There are different options. I mean, the young woman you saw here before, Sandra, she is getting a master's in social work. And so I talked with her. Her plan is to sort of get her master's, go out and do some work in the community, and then probably apply to PhD programs. She obviously has a lot of interest in research and is very smart and has the skills, and I think a lot of, motivation to do that. So, I was somebody who did that. So I got my BA, I got a master's in social work. I worked as a social worker. And then I realized that there were a lot of issues and questions and concerns out in the community that I was dealing with that I felt we needed more research and more knowledge and scholarship about. So I went back to school, and that experience really helped me. There are other people I work with who go straight through from undergraduate. Often it's because they have a very compelling question or a passion that they want to pursue, and they see the opportunity to do that. I think your example of Esteban, of how your life can take you in different directions is really important, that you may come in thinking you're very passionate about one thing, and while you're in school, I think the majority of PhD students learn that they might be passionate about something else, or learn about something, their world expands. So I think in terms of thinking about coming here, I probably shouldn't say this to someone from LA, but I'm from LA, and I got my master's in social work in Chicago. I ended up having my whole career basically outside of California, which was not my intention when I left, but it has ended up being a very interesting and exciting thing to do. And I think connecting to places like Southwest Detroit, I've been doing work also with Hispanic Latino communities in Toronto, and learning about sort of the Canadian experience. And I think being here in a border region with Canada sort of made me more interested in that as I saw the interactions across the border between Windsor and Detroit. So leaving, you know, the area where you're from also really opens up other perspectives and other possibilities.
To Esteban about the problematic negotiation between celebrating the Latino Hispanic heritage in a place like New Mexico, where the foundational character, Juan Oñate, actually cut off the feet of Pueblo Indians in the Acoma massacre, and it's still, you know, a contentious issue there. And so I imagine as a state historian, it's difficult to negotiate celebrating heritage between groups like that. But actually, I'm going to direct this to Catherine. What are the pitfalls in places like Michigan in asserting identity and rights in a place where they have been hard won and hard fought by the African American community? I remember in North Carolina, Latinos at Duke were often, and in Durham and Chapel Hill, got into a Me Tooism sort of mode and saying, well, you've got all these increased numbers of African American faculty, now it's our turn, without really valuing the blood, sweat, and tears that allowed the African American intellectual presence at Duke to find its voice. So what are the challenges there that face us in a place like Michigan?
One of the most difficult interviews I had when I was still interviewing teenagers, actually in the Reggaeton store, was a young Mexican American African American kid who was ashamed. He was really ashamed. He was proud of his grandmother who taught him Spanish. He did not want to acknowledge the African American identity. And I realized that I was speaking right on a very contentious issue, and tried to turn this conversation and said, but you have two cultures, you know, you have such power. You know, you speak English, you speak Spanish, you're fluent in Spanish, you can travel, you know, the city. And okay, so so that is what has happened is actually the idea of multi-ethnic alliances, I think, is something that has to be kept in mind. And for those of you who've lived here the past couple of years, you know the Kwame Kilpatrick scandal, and everything was riding on it, and there was some Afrocentrism, you know, bound up with that, and that was part of the sort of sore feelings within the community about underrepresentation on the council, was that Kwame had promoted that kind of line, those kind of trade-offs. And the response was there were two different responses. One was a class-based response of let's organize, as you heard from the Centro Obrero, you know, we have to create alliances among workers, all of whom are being displaced, laid off, have housing issues. There have been important alliances, such as Kenneth Cockrell, who was the president of the council, who actually was the person who pushed through the legislation prohibiting Detroit police force from questioning anyone in the neighborhood. And so I believe that those alliances are possible. That also doesn't make the news, right? And that's part of the problem with this undermediation, is that the regional population here is not aware of any of those political dynamics, because what sells is, of course, the Fox News Kwame Kilpatrick scandal. So I believe that there are a number of alternative positions involving those alliances that include Asian American, Arab American, and components of the progressive African American community that have been proactive.
Yeah, I just wanted to address what Danielle just was asking about, with the fact that there is at the University of Michigan a great deal more sympathy for Black American issues than for Latino issues and so on. And I think that that's true. And it's something that I have struggled with a lot over the years in different committees and so on, because it becomes sort of very obvious, and I remember once when I was, a young assistant professor, and I was on the President's Advisory Commission on Minority Affairs, that it became so obvious that I raised the issue at a meeting, that it seems that all the discussion here is about black students and black faculty and so on, but what about the Latino presence and so on? And former President Robin Fleming, whom I thought the world of, actually wrote me a letter afterwards telling me, he took the trouble to write a letter to let me know that the reason was that the proportion of Latinos in the state of Michigan was so low, about 2.5%, while the presence of black Americans was so high, and particularly in the city of Detroit, which was right next door to us, so that they felt that it was a justified presence. So I think that that's still a struggle, here. I don't think that that's something that we have won at all.